For over 100 years, we've been told a story. A story that Europe went to Africa to civilize, to bring trade, and to end slavery. It's a narrative repeated in history books and documentaries. But behind the noble speeches, the signed treaties, and the waving flags was a completely different motive. It was a motive driven by money, power, and a fierce global competition. This is the real and varnished story of why Europe scrambled for Africa. Let's start by dismantling the biggest lie, the so-called civilizing mission. European leaders, from kings to prime ministers, spoke passionately about bringing Christianity and progress to what they called the Dark Continent. But the truth is, Africa was already home to sophisticated civilizations. It had established governments and complex legal systems. It had vast trade networks that crisscrossed the continent and connected to the wider world. There were even universities, like the ancient Sankar University in Timbuktu, that were centers of learning long before many in Europe. It was a justification for what was to come, a convenient cover story for a much more practical and ruthless agenda. By the late 1800s, Europe was in the middle of a massive transformation, the Industrial Revolution. Factories were churning out goods at an unprecedented rate, and these factories were hungry. They needed a constant supply of raw materials to keep the machines running. And where could they find these materials in abundance? Africa. Rubber from the Congo was vital for tires and machinery. Copper was needed for electrical wiring. Palm oil was used for everything from lubricants to soap. And of course, there was gold and diamonds, the ultimate symbols of wealth. This wasn't about charity. It was about economics. Controlling the source of these raw materials meant controlling global industry. To secure their economic future, European powers knew they needed to secure Africa. The scramble wasn't a mission of mercy, it was a corporate takeover on a continental scale. But the hunger for resources was only part of the story. The scramble for Africa was also a direct result of intense rivalry between European nations. Think of it like a high-stakes game of chess, where Africa was the board. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal were all competing for dominance. If one country claimed a piece of territory, the others felt pressured to grab their own. Simply to keep up, they were terrified of being left behind. Colonies weren't just about resources. They were symbols of power and prestige. A large empire meant you were a major player on the world stage. Africa became the primary arena where these European empires flexed their muscles and competed for status. The fate of millions of Africans was being decided by a game of imperial one-upmanship played thousands of miles away. This chaotic land grab eventually became so intense that it threatened to spark a war between the European powers themselves. To avoid this, they decided to do something unprecedented. In 1884, representatives from 14 European nations and the United States gathered in Berlin. Their goal was to set rules for the division of Africa. This meeting is now infamous as the Berlin Conference. No African leaders were invited. No one was there to represent the interests of the people whose continent was being carved up like a cake. With rulers and pens, the diplomats in Berlin drew lines on a map. These lines created the borders of the countries we see in Africa today, but they were drawn with complete disregard for the existing realities on the ground. They cut through ancient kingdoms, split ethnic groups apart, and forced rival communities into the same new colony. These artificial borders, born from European convenience, would become a source of conflict and instability that would plague the continent long after the colonial rulers had left. Once control was established, the colonial systems were not designed for the development of Africa or its people. They were Designed for one thing, extraction. The entire infrastructure was built to serve this purpose. Railroads were constructed not to connect African cities or economies, but to move resources from the interior to the coastal ports, where they could be shipped to Europe. Education for Africans was severely limited, often just enough to create a lower class of clerks and laborers to help run the colonial administration. Political power was taken from local rulers and centralized in the hands of European governors. Any form of resistance, whether peaceful or violent, was brutally punished. The goal was never to build self-sufficient, prosperous African nations,